Muslim sources are a bit difficult to know what to deal with. So, for example, they say that Muhammad is alive during the conquest of Jerusalem. So he's alive. In the Muslim accounts, he dies in Arabia. That's it. Before the conquest had properly started, that happens with his successor, Abu Bakr. But in a number of Christian sources, they have him go to Palestine. And the aim, it seems, is that he wants to capture Jerusalem. Jerusalem is key to his program in the Christian account, but that's not really there in the Muslim account.
That really piqued my interest. You can see why.
Yeah, sure.
Have you met Dr. Hoyland? And what are your thoughts, maybe?
Only a couple times. Oh, he's a real inspiration. I mean, his work on seeing Islam really made this all possible in a way for folks to just time look at the full panoply of the sources available for thinking about the beginnings of Islam, right? I mean, he wasn't the first to sort of draw our attention to this. We owe that to Sebastian Brock and to Patricia Crona and Michael Cook. But he was the first to systematically inventory all of these texts. And up until that point, this really, we're talking in the late 70s. It's not that long ago when Brock and Crona and Cook first said, "Hey, what about all the Christian sources?" People were only looking at the Islamic sources for any knowledge of the beginnings of Islam, and of course it's no secret that these sources are all written down very late. They are based on memories that are being told orally for 100 years at least in most cases. The Christian sources or the non-Islamic sources, by and large, are written, in the middle of things to a large extent. Some of them are later. He catalogs those as well, but they're all a very important witness to what is going on in this part of the world in this time and place. I mean, it's, for instance, I suppose a lot of your audience is familiar with early Christian studies, right? No one who's trying to understand the beginnings of Christianity would just simply ignore all of the evidence we can glean from Greco-Roman literature for understanding the context and even understanding what these people are saying about Christianity. So.
Well put. Very well put. So the title of the show today is "Did Muhammad Lead an Invasion of Palestine?" If you're ready, let's begin. So the first thing I'd like to bring up is Sebios. If I'm pronouncing that correct, is it Sebios?
would say Sabaeus.
Sabaeus. Okay, I want to try and be on the same wavelength of pronunciation as much as possible. So, Sabaeus, I would like to start by showing a video of our first manuscript, Sabaeus. This manuscript is kept at the, and I'm going to butcher this, Mantidarian in Yerevan, Armenia.
Matinidarian in Yerevan.
Yerevan, Armenia.
Matinidarian. Mm-hmm.
I tried, I really did.
Yeah, it's a mouthful. It's a mouthful.
For anybody who's wanting to source me, and I hope they do, especially if you're being critical of what I have going on, here's the website that you can go and actually check it out yourself. So make sure you do so. With that being said, let me go ahead and play the clip.
For the first time in Armenia, someone talks about Muhammad, mentions him by name, and says a little bit about what he did. Sabaeus himself was talking about the events around the year 630, which was before Muhammad had actually died.
Sabaeus gives a surprisingly accurate account of Muhammad's background and teachings.
Translating from the Armenian. At that time, a certain man whose name was Muhammad, which is the usual name for Muhammad in Armenian, a merchant, as if by the command of God, appeared to them as a preacher. Now, Muhammad gave them laws, namely, not to eat carrion, not to drink wine, not to speak falsehood, and not to engage in fornication.
There's a short clip of Sabaeus.
Yeah.
And so this is a voice that, like you said, we wouldn't want to ignore Greco-Roman sources on Christianity that are non-Christian, and Sabaeus is one of these that is non-Muslim. And this manuscript is a printed version of several Armenian texts, out of which one of them is Sabaeus. It was copied in 1672 from the original Sabaeus manuscript, which was written in 660 AD. And I just want to mention that. Can you tell us more about this and how important it is?
Yeah, this account from Sabaeus is, I would say, probably the single most important account we have about the beginnings of Muhammad's new religious movement, which is, for various reasons, I don't call it Islam at this point. I don't think they even call themselves Muslims at this point. And what Islam is something that develops later out of this religion. They seem to have called themselves the believers, which is a hypothesis that Fred Donner advanced, and I think it is quite correct. So I think it's probably the best witness we have. And for instance, actually, my friend and colleague Sean Anthony, who you also mention, we more or less agree on this. We disagree about a lot of stuff. We work together about things. We're friends. We argue a lot. But one thing I think we both agreed on, and forgive me, Sean, if I'm speaking out of turn for you, but we both agree that this account of Sabaoth is really, really important. Now, how we understand it, well, he and I might understand it somewhat differently, but it's not just that the Chronicle is written around 660, we think. But according to Robert Thompson and the others who worked on it, the Chronicle made use of older sources. And we believe that for this section, or they believe, and I believe them, they're more expert on this than I am, that this particular section about the beginnings of Islam was probably written around the 640s by an author in Jerusalem. And this author tells us that he got his information by talking with people who had been taken captive among Muhammad's followers and had just spent some time with them. So, can we believe any of this? Well, it's always a question. I mean, this is the thing about trying to reconstruct the past. We have to be suspicious, but we're also trying to find what's probable. And there are a lot of probables in favor of this source being as reliable a source as we're going to find. And one of the things that's interesting about it, too, is as it continues on, this was something that wasn't in your clip from Robert Thompson. Sebius talks about how Muhammad and his followers, a group of Jews and Arabs together, united together in a single cause, their goal was to liberate the Holy Land, the promised land of Abraham. They're both descendants of Abraham, right? They both, as descendants of Abraham, have a right to the land according to biblical tradition. And so this would explain, right? I go back to your comment from Professor Hoyland, Robert, the other Robert. It does seem there's a lot of noise in the non-Christian sources around their main goal and the Holy Land. And now he suggested something. I think that in the Islamic sources there's not so much to corroborate that, but I think there is, and I've written about this. You'll see some of this in the Death of the Prophet, especially, and also in Apocalypse of Empire. There is a lot of noise also in the Islamic tradition about Jerusalem. You only have to look at the Dome of the Rock to see that there's something going on there. Right? This was the first Islamic monument built. It's not a mosque. It's built over the site of the temple. Right? Jerusalem still retains this third holiest status in the Islamic tradition today. All of Islam's eschatological traditions, its apocalyptic traditions, remain honored to Jerusalem and to Temple Mount. Where's all this coming from if it's not that Jerusalem was important pretty early on, right? If from the beginning it had been all about Mecca and Medina, then why would all this stuff for Jerusalem come in the first place, right? On the other hand, if Jerusalem was important in the beginning and then things sort of shifted a little bit and Mecca and Medina became more important, then it's kind of easy to understand why there are all these vestiges of Jerusalem's significance lying around in a religion that for centuries now has seen Mecca and Medina as its main holy places.
Wow, that is wonderfully put. I really appreciate you talking about that. And we're going to bring up a few of those sources visually for people here in just the coming time. The Doctrina Jacobi, am I saying this correct? Jacobi? Doctrina Jacobi?
Again, I would say Jacobi, but take the time.
Hey, just making sure, I'm trying. I would like to show our second manuscript, the Doctrina Jacobi, if I'm saying this correct. This manuscript is kept at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, and just for everybody to do a good service and be critical, go and check it out. In fact, you can do the website in French or English to go check my sources. You think I'm making this up? Go check it out yourself. I'm saying that for those who are so skeptical you can't believe a word I'm saying, and I understand. That's okay. So just for everybody's awareness, this particular manuscript is a 10th century copy of the original that was written in 634 AD in Greek. Inside of the red portion is the actual part of the text that says, "A prophet appeared with the Saracens," or if you will, Arabs. Can you tell us a little bit about this situation here between these two? This is just a continuation in the next page on the doctrine of Jacob.
Yeah, this is an incredibly remarkable text. There's some people who would debate it, who would place it a little bit later in time, but there's a pretty strong consensus at the moment that this is indeed a text that reflects some circumstances in 634 in a particular community of converted Jews in North Africa. The broader context of all of this is it's a debate among these Jews. There had been a forced baptism, and many of the Jews had been baptized unwillingly, and some of them decided, well, okay, let's become Christians, and they're debating about, whether this was a good idea, and then someone new comes in who wasn't there when all this happened, and he's having a debate with them about whether they should have embraced Christianity. And then sort of in the middle of all of this, someone gets a letter from a relative who's back in Palestine, and this letter says, hey, here's what's going on back here in Palestine. This prophet has appeared coming with the Saracens, right? And the account continues. It says, he says he has the keys of the kingdom, if I remember correctly. And there's the Jewish author says that he seems to be preaching that the Messiah is coming. Whether that's something that was actually this prophet was saying, or whether that sounded in Jewish ears, that's another question. Well, I think it could be both ways, but yeah, this is the first source we have that mentions Muhammad, not by name, but I run in some interesting groups. I mean, I have some colleagues who want to argue that Muhammad didn't even exist, and that the name Muhammad is kind of the name Muhammad, right? Just means the praised one. And so it's not really a name, it's just it's a title that was given to him, and but he wasn't really a real person and things like that. Well, to them I say, actually, two sources we've talked about put that to rest. And I know Bart, who was one of my mentors, he had to write a whole book, arguing that Jesus actually existed. Some people are so skeptical. I hope I'm not offending any of your audience out there, but these kind of things are a little too skeptical, right? Again, we're dealing with probability, and it's highly probable that Jesus existed. It's highly probable that there was a prophet who his followers called Muhammad, who was at the beginning of this religious movement, right? And two main sources are going to be that we have this text from 634 saying that he's alive and he's coming to the Holy Land. And then we also have this text which we just talked about, Sebeos, right, which names him Muhammad. And so between these two, I think there's, it's pretty hard to to me, you're wasting time about something that's relatively, if you're arguing that, you're wasting time about something that's pretty settled, when there are a lot more interesting things to debate that are in the air. So
I'm with you on that, and I'm definitely someone who thinks that it's more probable there was a guy. Though I wouldn't mind interviewing someone who's an academic who is taking a different position. I'd be interested to hear what they have to say, but I'm like that with you as well in that particular position. Moving on to Michael the Syrian. Now we move on to our third manuscript, and I want everybody to take the opportunity to look at this particular church. This is this church, St. George Church in Aleppo, Syria, is actually where they keep the manuscript, or is kept. It's kept there right now, and you can look into this yourself. This is the manuscript that we're talking about. And it's a copy of the original written in Syriac before 1199 AD. In particular, what we're trying to zero in on is this part right here. And this part right here on this manuscript, the translation of the yellow highlighted text says, "He began to make from them for himself a band, and he went out to make raids in the land of Palestine." Isn't this indisputable proof that Muhammad did lead an invasion into Palestine? At least historically, if we're making an argument. What are your thoughts?
Well, what it proves is that someone remembered that, right? Now, there's another step to say, why did they remember that? Did they remember that because that's what really happened? Or is there another reason that that memory came to be? That's one sort of way to look at this. Another way to look at this too is, what does Palestine mean? Because so we think of Palestine as maybe what's today the land that has the states of Israel and Palestine in it. In the Roman period, Palestine was much larger, and so there was a region of Palestine that went fairly far out into the deserts to the east and the south of the Roman Empire. And we do indeed in Muhammad's biographies have some traditions of him leading raids up into this territory. So is that all it is? It could be, but what we find instead is, we find out that that's not the only piece of evidence. If that were the only thing that said Muhammad went to Palestine, then it would be pretty reasonable to say, yeah, that's what it's referring to. But when we pull together all these other sources, right, and in the death of a prophet, I think I have 11 or 12 of them, I can't remember. One of them is a Jewish source, actually. They're not all Christian sources, as Robert said. And one of them is an early Islamic source that seems to indicate that Muhammad was going with them as they went forth into this part of the world. And the Christian sources are spread out, in different confessional communities. The Christians are divided amongst themselves at this point. But we have a source from Spain that says, we have this Armenian source, right? We have Arabic Egyptian source. We've got this Greek source from North Africa, right? When you those of your viewers who do know historical Jesus stuff, who know Bart stuff, we're talking about multiple independent attestation, right? We're talking about a tradition that is reported independently multiple times, right? And when you have that kind of evidence, that's the gold standard, as I always say. That's the best we're going to get. So what we have is not just a report in Chronicle Michael the Syrian, which is quite late, actually. And the value of that witness depends on the fact that it seems to be using an older source that eventually goes back into the early 8th century, if I'm remembering correctly. It's been a while since I've worked on some of this. But when you get all of this together, you have to reckon with the fact that there clearly was, in the 7th century, a memory that Muhammad was still alive at the time of the Islamic conquest. Does that mean that actually happened? I can't say that. What I can say is, for some reason, a lot of different people were remembering that time in a way that involved Muhammad's leadership of this invasion of the Near East. Not necessarily even just Palestine. Some sources are vague, saying he's leading the leadership of the Near East, but he's supposed to die in Medina before any of that happens. And here's another thing with this tradition. We don't get any tradition that contradicts it. So we have it, multiple independent attestation in a dozen sources from all over the place in the first century of Islam. We don't get anything that contradicts it until 100 years after Muhammad's death. And that's when we get the first written records of the Islamic tradition about the end of Muhammad's life, where he becomes ill and dies in Medina before all of this happens. Now, is it possible that what the Islamic tradition remembers is true? Yes, it is possible, right? But on the other hand, is it possible that these other reports, which are earlier and which, unlike the Islamic tradition, have multiple independent attestation in their favor, that at least we could say that this was the earliest memory about the end of Muhammad's life, right? Maybe it's not true either, but I think the evidence speaks very strongly that the earliest memory was of Muhammad still alive and leading at this time. And the Islamic tradition has a different memory that only appears later on. And so what the death of a prophet was basically an attempt to think about, well, okay, how do we deal with this difference in our sources, right? And how would someone say this was Jesus if we had traditions about Jesus that were like this, right? How would someone who was a Jesus scholar, who was a New Testament scholar, go about trying to sort through the different reports and validate them historically? And if we think this was an early tradition, that Muhammad was still alive, why do we get a later tradition in the Islamic sources that he died before all this happened? And the broader argument you'll see across a lot of my books is, again, it goes back to this reorientation about Jerusalem. I think it's really clear that they were more interested in Jerusalem than they were in Mecca and Medina in the early decades. This is not a horribly controversial thing to say even, right? The original direction of prayer, it's quite clear. Very few people would dispute this, was Jerusalem. Even in the Islamic sources, there's a memory of this, right? What's going on? Well, I think Jerusalem was their main holy site. It was the aspiration of their religion in these early decades, and only later, for a variety of reasons. I guess I'll give you a teaser. If you want to find out why, you gotta buy the book. It's a little complicated to explain here too, but their sacred geography, I think, changes. I think Jerusalem's important at first. Mecca and Medina become more important later on. Some people say, oh, they have nothing to do with Mecca and Medina. Well, again, I think that we don't have to go there, right? We don't have to go there. We can simply say, well, here's a pattern that Jerusalem seems to have been important originally. Mecca and Medina probably emerged as important later on. And I think if we're looking for a context in which memories about how Muhammad ended his life could change, it's in the context of that change, right? Once Jerusalem and the Holy Land isn't the end-all be-all, but Mecca and Medina become what's important, you're going to want to remember the end of Muhammad's life in a way that fits with what you believe. And that is, in the 8th century, the holiness of Mecca and Medina as a unique, distinctly Islamic holy land.
This factors in wonderful stuff that Sean Anthony talks about in his book about whether Muhammad was a shepherd or a merchant, and the non-Muslim sources, they don't shy away. They just say, yeah, he was a merchant, he was this, he was that. And then you have this kind of shy away happening where he's more of a shepherd in the Islamic tradition. So I think you're on to something here. Maybe we'll talk more about that as we get through. Once we're done with some of these sources, it'll be cool to maybe like small talk on a little bit of this here. But this fragment of the Arab conquest in 636 AD, this little circled spot right here, I think, is Robert Hoyland's actual. He had circled this initially where Muhammad's name comes up. Can you tell us about the fragment of the Arab conquest?
I looked at it once a long time ago. I think it's debated whether this is actually reconstructed as Muhammad. So there's not universal agreement that this is, if I'm remembering correctly, there's not universal agreement that this is the earliest attestation of Muhammad. And this is a pretty vague fragment. It doesn't tell us much other than that the followers of Muhammad had appeared on the scene, right? That could mean a lot of things, actually, right? The followers of Muhammad could be people who were following Muhammad who was dead by this time, right? So again, on its own, if this were the only source that had any kind of indication in this regard, we would probably say, yeah, well, that's what it means, right? But when you start lining it up again with all of these other reports, you kind of have to wonder if even this source, as vague as it is also bearing witness to a group of Muhammad's followers who are coming into the Near East, quite possibly with him still as their leader.
Wow. Okay. What about this source, Thomas the Presbyter, 640 AD? Is there anything magical about this that we should look at?
Yeah, I'm racking my head. I can't remember exactly what that source says without looking at it, and I don't have, I'm not with, my library is not here with me in Germany, unfortunately, and I haven't been thinking about this stuff in a while, but actually, if you want to see what Thomas says, by the way, shameless plug, you can go get my book, Prophet Has Appeared, which translates all of these sources with historical commentary. It's really designed for classroom use, so I think it would be good for a lot of your audience. Yep, there it is, Prophet Has Appeared. So we could all go look at that and refresh our memories as to what
I can't recommend these books enough. Like, I really hope people will take the time to go get them, and they're fun to read. Even the introduction, I'm currently reading in particular on the book on the far right for those watching, The Apocalypse of Empire. It forces me to have the death of a prophet, and then that's forced me, going backwards, of course, you could already tell, but I'm really, really wanting to get through all this stuff, and maybe we can have an episode teasing everybody to join and go get it and take a look at it.